You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to this midweek special episode of the podcast. And in this one, I chat with Dr. Jon Hoffman of the Neurobehavioral Institute in Florida and Dr. Amirsaman Sajad, a neuroscientist at Vanderbilt University. And in particular, we talk about what is neuroscience, the difference between brain and mind, what goes on in the brain of OCD, how can neuroscience improve therapy for OCD, the importance of psychotherapy and neuroscience working together, and why some people don't have confidence in science and research anymore. And these midweek special episodes, which go out at the end of the month on a Wednesday, are made possible by and in partnership with the Neurobehavioral Institute in Florida, or NBI for short. I will be interviewing different members of their clinical team on a range of topics. NBI specialise in treatment and programs for anxiety, OCD, comorbidities, and complex cases. They also offer an intensive outpatient program and a residential program called the NBI Ranch, a supportive living experience that complements intensive treatment for anxiety and obsessive-compulsive related disorders. To find out more about their intensive outpatient services or the NBI Ranch, as well as to read some of their free information online about OCD via their blog, visit nbiwestern.com. So I really enjoyed this conversation. It's not something I've covered a lot in the past, so it was great to get Jon and Amir on to discuss this with me. And thank you to both of them, of course, for their time. Thank you to NBI for helping make this episode possible. And thank you to you guys for listening. As always, it means a lot. And without further ado, here is Jon and Amir. Welcome to the podcast, Jon and Amir.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you both on. So it would be good if you could both just briefly introduce yourself, who you are and what you're about.
You go first.
Okay, yes. So I'm a research assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and my work is on studying the neural mechanisms of cognitive control. And I work with animal models to discover the circuitry that underlies a lot of the visual motor and cognitive functions that are also affected in several neuropsychiatric disorders. And I use a variety of techniques that I'm happy to explain further if you're interested.
Brilliant. Absolutely. Yeah. We'll get into that in a bit.
Hi, I'm Jon Hoffman. I'm Chief Clinical Officer and founder of NBI and NBI Ranch. And I'm really thrilled to be here and discuss something that's kind of near and dear to my heart, which is the connection between neuroscience and OCD and its treatment. And, Amir actually came down to NBI and shared with us his remarkable research, and we had a chance to really disseminate some really important information to our staff, which has really sparked it really coincided with a lot of our interests. And since he does basic research and we do clinical applications of research, it seemed like kind of a natural collaboration, which I think is really important for our field's future, actually, and has specific bearings upon OCD, which I know we're going to get into today. So again, kind of thrilled to be here and talk about the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Exciting to have you both on. And I guess I wanted to start with, so we're going to talk about neuroscience and OCD. So I just wanted to go back to basics of what is neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Should I?
Yeah, go
please.
for it.
Yeah. So neuroscience is the study of the brain, of course. And now from centuries ago, humans have been studying the brain in some ways. And with the advent of technology, we have now started to study the brain at different scales, for all the way from the molecules and the cells up to the circuits that give rise to behavior. And so it's a very multidimensional field, multidisciplinary field, and it intersects with psychology, neurobiology, and even physics and mathematics. And these days, computer science is integrated with everything. So I would say, generally speaking, is how does the brain bring about function that we observe in our world? And the difference with psychology is psychology describes the behavior, neuroscience describes the underlying mechanisms that lead to that behavior.
That's a good.
And I want to jump in and say that at NBI, to the extent possible, we think it's very important to bridge that gap, to say that behavior and we'll talk about mind in a moment, I hope, behavior and sensory information and brain functioning they're not that unrelated. But we're especially interested in NBI is how to connect our conception of CBT and how to use CBT and bring it to bear in helping people with OCD in a way that actually intersects with what Amir is talking about, not to make them different worlds, because it is our basic understanding that by changing behavior, by introducing certain behavioral exercises, we can influence neurobiology and neuroplasticity. And I know we all talk about, hey, that therapy changes neurobiology, but I think the really important thing, and this probably will dovetail into our discussion about just science using science-informed ideas in general. The question is really, how does it do that? And one of the issues for me is that psychology often has like a black box approach where we say, oh, we do this and somehow it changes neuroplasticity or neurobiology. But we often don't discuss, and certainly don't discuss with patients, exactly how it does that. So one of the things, again, that's fascinating to me about working with Amir and with other scientists is they're helping us really understand better how that actually works. And I think that's super important, because if we just say, well, our treatments works, that's good enough, that's not very scientific. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important that we stay in the realm of science for what we do as much as humanly possible, understanding there are other aspects as well.
And the other side of it, if I may, is that as neuroscientists, we are so obsessed with learning about the brain, and a lot of neuroscientists lose sight of the applications when it comes to clinical work. And a lot of what I did early on in my PhD and early on in my postdoc, I had no idea how much application there could be in the clinical world and how much of interest it could be to clinicians. So I look forward to working with people, clinicians like NBI, actually, to do something that's unique.
And I will mention that Amir made a tremendous presentation to some of our patients, and they were really interested as well, which was surprisingly, I would say surprisingly, so why shouldn't they be interested? But they were really interested in understanding these processes as opposed to talking about it in general terms. So sometimes I think we kind of dilute information clinically, thinking that either people won't understand or it's not important. They just want to look at just like how we're going to change symptomatology. But I think there is a real interest, which I saw firsthand with Amir's presentation, being able to and part of that is his gift, to be able to describe these very complicated mechanisms in a way that patients can relate to. And I think that's opens a whole new area of possibilities for us in terms of collaborative and translational types of projects.
Yeah, and some of the conversations that I had with the patients after my talk actually led to very interesting ways for me to frame my research, and they were asking questions that were directly related to application, the way that I didn't think about. I was so pleased to find that patients were actually so excited about research. They valued it so much, I could tell.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. And I think with people with OCD, I guess with any psychiatric disorder, there's such a thirst for just understanding of what the hell is going on in my brain. And, am I weird? Is something broken? So, yeah, I'm sure neuroscience, as it progresses, especially can give a lot of reassuring answers, comforting answers, I should say. So I'm glad it was.
Yeah, what I think it's important to distinguish right now, and I'd love to hear Amir and your thoughts on this too, is I think we interchange the words mind and brain a lot in our field. And sometimes when I'm hearing about like things that we'll call like objective study of the mind, I'm always like, really? How do you do that? How do you like scientifically study the mind? And yet a lot of what we do in psychology is, and I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but I think it's really, we need to understand what we're really studying when we're studying the mind, that it's not the same as studying the brain. And I think that differentiation and And that relationship is one that's fraught with all sorts of different opinions and controversies. And, brain science is not necessarily synonymous with mind science. And one could even go as far to say is, can actually purporting to do mind science, and you can see my bias in just the way I said that, does that actually interfere with our understanding of brain science and muddy the waters there? Mm-hmm. So I'll just throw that out there for conversation's sake, because I think it's just kind of a fascinating topic to discuss about how we view this relationship between mind, body, and behavior.
And this is what I meant by a lot of what we consider as neuroscience. Like, a lot of neuroscientists are trying to identify the brain mechanisms for concepts that existed centuries ago from philosophy, like mind, for instance. They were talking about a lot of these concepts back then without understanding how the brain works. And now neuroscience is trying to figure out what does the brain do, and how does it bring about functions that come together that we describe it as thought or mind, and things like that. So there's a distinction between the brain and mind, as John mentioned.
Yeah. So like the way I kind of see it in my very bad understanding in neuroscience is that the brain is the organic organ, and then the mind is something the brain is creating through electric impulses and is that impulse?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, let me just mention to you. Now, I don't know if you have an agenda of certain questions, or can I just
go for it? Yeah, absolutely.
So let me tell you something that's to me is the most exciting aspect of my work, is that even within neuroscience, what you find is different techniques are trying to get to the same questions, right? Mm-hmm. And for instance, when it comes, one function that I study is, how do we learn from mistakes that we make? How does the brain learn from the mistakes, and what are the adjustments in behavior that come after that to optimize behavior in the long run? And this is actually one of the functions that are compromised in major neuropsychiatric disorders. So the way the literature has studied this for decades is using behavioral studies. They look at the behavior. How do people make corrections? For instance, if you make a mistake, if you knock over a coffee cup, the next time you want to reach for it, you're going to be more careful. You're going to pause a little, ponder. You're going to look at it more carefully. But also, so in addition to that behavioral aspect, the field also looks at brain signals like EEG, for instance, the electroencephalography, which is measuring neural activity on the head. And actually, there's a biomarker associated with error, the error-related negativity. And what is really fascinating is that when you make a mistake, you get a negative voltage over the frontal lobe. But in OCD patients, this negative voltage is exaggerated, is larger in amplitude on average. In schizophrenia patients who don't learn from their mistakes, often the ERN is attenuated. And so one thing our colleagues did at Vanderbilt is they used a technology called transcranial direct current stimulation, which is essentially like a battery, and they put over the head. And they injected, I'm using the term injection, but not literally injecting, but basically they gave a negative pulse over the head that compensated for that negative voltage in schizophrenia patients. And they found that they were now having improvements in behavior in a way that they didn't before, right? They were learning from their mistakes. The problem is, these methods are very broad. They are influencing a lot of the brain, and we don't really know what's happening under the skull. And that's why we go to the animal models and we do neural recordings at the high resolution of single neurons and different parts of the brain to understand how does the circuitry come together to bring about this function of error realization and adjustments in behavior. And this also has implications for drug discovery, of course, because once we know exactly the circuitry underlying it, we can start to manipulate it with drugs and compensate for the deficits that exist. And so you can see even in neuroscience, there are different levels of study studying the brain that need to come together to really give us the holistic picture of what is happening, from all the way from single neuron level to this non-invasive recording of the neural signals about the head,
And the question for us as psychologists working clinically with people with OCD is, can we do exposure in a way that kind of gets at the same result? Because if you say, in a way, your brain is comes from an article that I co-authored with Dean McKay and Warren Tryon, that if you think of the brain as a network of neural networks that's actually conducting, as Amir said, that it's math, it's algorithms. And maybe there's medicines can affect this, maybe the battery pulse can affect this, but maybe that's a way of looking how in a different way about what exposure and response prevention does, by inducing kind of like dissonant or incompatible behaviors with the OCD. Is it sparking some changes in the algorithms that allow you to approach what you would have avoided in the past? And if we understand this research more, maybe that's going to help us get much more specific, beyond self-report from people. Maybe if we're using these biomarkers to actually how to target ERP. And that's one of the things that I think is kind of an idea for that we really should be thinking about for the future. All these different ways to influence the algorithms of OCD, in which the brain is computing, I guess, together with some physiological information, that something is to be avoided, which does not necessarily need to be avoided. Or interesting that your mind actually thinks no good, and your behavior is avoidant, which tells your brain no good, except that it's all confused and incorrect. So what is the corrective information on any of these domains that can be provided?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess I could be completely wrong here, but maybe thinking about medicine, you may not even need to target the system that's going wrong if you could target a system that could counteract it. I don't know, like some other system, if it's increased, it gives you the courage, I'm doing this in speech marks, to then do the exposure, and then that rights the wrong anyway through doing the therapy.
Well, it is interesting because you can think of it in very this kind of this very micro level in terms of this exact circuit, or down to just the really very single neuron level. Or you could think of it the way we would think of exercising a muscle, that you don't think, well, I'm going to get this nerve fiber, that fiber, but if I know generally if I put more weight on it, then it expects that this is an anti-fragile system, meaning that it tends to get better with testing it to the limits. It tends to get better in challenge. That's really what we're taking advantage of in exposure and response prevention, is that hopefully these systems are what is called anti-fragile and will develop under stress. And the fear of people with OCD is that they're going to collapse under stress. And it's up to us to show, hey, well, actually the opposite happens, and really, rely on the work of researchers like Amir to understand how to convey that information in an accurate way.
Mm-hmm.
Good point.
Yeah, that's very true. And something I just want to add as a thread of our work actually involves linking the biomarkers. Now, we are one of the only labs in the world that actually do this. We record EEG over the surface of the head, and we work with non-human primates. So they have the similar EEG biomarkers, and at the same time, we record neural activity inside the brain, right? And so we want to understand what aspects of the circuitry are giving rise to these biomarkers. Sure, we can use the biomarkers to detect certain disorders, but we need to understand the underlying circuitry to know subtle differences in the biomarkers may actually mean they may be meaningful with respect to subclasses of disorders. One of the issues right now with psychiatry is there is a lot of the classifications are too broad. For instance, OCD could actually be broken down to many biotypes, if you will. And so one of our goals as neuroscientists is to discover the set of biomarkers and a set of neural mechanisms that can explain heterogeneity within the population, within the patient population. And that's one of our missions. The long-term missions is to basically discover the constellation of biomarkers and behavioral factors. They can guide us in better diagnosis and ultimately better treatment strategies.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is it may look, all the compulsions, obsessions all may look fairly similar in a group of 100 patients, but there could be different sets of biomarkers just leading to those symptoms. So what we see on the surface is, exactly. I don't know why mushrooms are coming to my mind, right? You've got the mushrooms that you see, but there's so much underneath in the mycelium that could be different.
Exactly. Like that negative voltage that I explained over the frontal lobe, it could be generated by so many different mechanisms. And what you end up seeing is just that negative voltage over the frontal lobe. There could be 100 different combinations of brain activity that give rise to that, right? Yeah. The same with symptoms and neuropsychiatric disorders. What we see as symptoms of schizophrenia, hallucinations, or OCD, with obsessions and compulsions, they may just be one slice, basically the most prominent symptom that we have got to learn about throughout the years, but the underlying mechanisms may be different.
You know what strikes me is, like, if you go back into the history of mental health treatment, they would talk about things like corrective emotional experiences. But I think we're seeing the dawning of an era of corrective neurobiological experiences, neurobiological behavioral experiences, to just broaden it out more, that actually are going to help a brain by giving it different information, or actually teaching it the error of its ways by creating a discrepancy. Like the example that I frequently give is that if somebody touches something that the brain expects you now with OCD to avoid, like your whole biology, every fiber says don't touch it, and you touch it anyway, your brain has to grapple with, why is this person touching it? Right? And it has to it pressures that system to actually kind of make a conclusion, hopefully, that, well, maybe not so bad. Maybe I was wrong. Now, the brain is, the funny thing is that we can't purport to say that the brain is thinking in the way we think of a mind, but these are mathematical algorithms that we want to influence. And in fact, in many ways, we want to teach people to ignore what their mind is saying as they engage in this, that their mind actually doesn't have information, because when we think about it, how could the mind actually have any information about what the brain is doing? I mean, I think of the relationship this way, and I'm curious what Amir thinks, is that the analogy I would give is like a trumpet is playing some music, right? But once the music's out of the trumpet, it's not physical anymore. It exists in a different realm, and it can't go back into the trumpet. I mean, people could hear it and like it or not like it, and maybe the trumpet can be broken in some ways, or have structural or functional issues that maybe have to be addressed. But these are different realms that once, that's kind of called an emergent theory of mind, which kind of makes sense to me, that once it exists, and however it's produced by the brain, it is in a different realm. So, and I think it's a one-way street. So why do we think that making mental changes is going to directly influence the brain in the absence of a behavioral change? And then if you just need the behavioral change, maybe the mental change that we focus on so much in the world of psychology and therapy, maybe it doesn't really add much value to that. And I guess that's always one of my questions about what we're doing in terms of our therapies. Is the way they work really the way that we think they work, or do we really have to really look much closer at explanatory mechanisms and understand that perhaps a lot of the treatments that we do, they're working because they're involving a behavioral thing, and the cognitive aspect of it, perhaps, that people are putting so much stock in, maybe it's how much of what percentage of the variance and outcome is it really explaining? And I think that's I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a question that's really important for us all to take a hard look at.
As a neuroscientist, yeah, so I totally agree with you. And as a neuroscientist, we actually believe in studying the brain. It's the brain that's important to study to understand what is wrong with the system in certain psychiatric disorders. And like I always use this analogy of, if you want to fix a car, you need to know how it works. So it kind of starts with basic science. You really need to understand the underlying mechanisms for function, and then understand how they come together to bring about more complex functions that we sometimes characterize as mind, And so maybe the closest to, now I wonder what you guys think about neurofeedback. So neurofeedback is one of these techniques that are used that I don't know how much science, how much empirical evidence is in support of it. There are mixed results, I believe. But in that case, I think I like the idea of it is that you give the subject a particular task. It could be very simple, and you basically want to optimize the brain signals based on what they're doing, and you don't even understand what the subject is doing. All you're monitoring is the brain activity and trying the subject to figure out a way for that brain signature to come up, and you don't even understand the mechanism for it.
Well, this is a little out there, so I apologize. But I always think, I'm not an expert in neurofeedback, but it's interesting because the idea really behind it is that some awareness of it will help calm you down and you'll know what's happening. And the idea is to get into maybe more relaxed state or more attentive state. But I would almost wonder if giving the wrong feedback to your brain and performing the right behavior would actually be an interesting kind of exposure. Again, I don't know if that's completely off the deep end, as sometimes I am. But I think it's very interesting that to say, well, what are we really trying to do? Are we really trying to calm the systems down? Because I think that's kind of a paradigm clash within the field. Are we trying to calm it down, increase safety information, or are we actually able, or do we want to give your brain a workout with discrepant information that allows it to perform more optimally and congruently with actually objective danger? And do you really train it to calm by calming down and teaching it safety information, or do you really train it by giving it a challenge for which it has to adapt in a more constructive way? So I mean, that's a different way to think about neurofeedback. Yeah. But I think any type of feedback is useful. But I think we might be just looking at one side of the equation, and maybe there's parts of that are helpful. But I think the other side of neurofeedback is something that, to my knowledge, isn't explored. But it would be quite interesting to see.
Yeah, and it may be detrimental. It may actually be detrimental.
It may actually be detrimental.
So,
it reminds me of when people would do systematic desensitization, that by relaxing in the presence of a fear, it seems to make kind of common sense, but it didn't turn out to be as good as not relaxing in the presence of the fear and just performing the adaptive behavior in the presence of the fear, a la exposure. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if we have a similar situation to explore theoretically in that way as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. But I said there's just so many questions here, right, that we don't yet have the answers to. But
at least I think we're asking questions, right? Instead of just saying, kind of, we really understand this. Well, everyone would get better if we really understood it, right?
Yeah.
And I think one interesting thing to say is that there's such discrepancy. There's not only heterogeneity in people with OCD, there's a lot of heterogeneity in what people who treat OCD think is important, mm-hmm. or the important questions, or even the kind of theory of OCD. There's a lot of differences.
Yeah, mm-hmm. True. Yeah, good point. And to both of you, so Amir, you mentioned earlier, I can't remember what it was in the brain that you noticed in OCD patients that it was supercharged, that part.
The error-related negativity, ERN.
Yes. ERN. Okay, so the ERN. Is there anything else that we know from neuroscience that is kind of either going wrong in the brain or is supercharged with OCD this time?
Yeah. So when you do MRI, like with functional MRI, when you scan the brain of OCD patients compared to healthy controls, you find that there are several brain areas that are actually hyperactive or active in a different way. Orbital frontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, caudate nucleus. I mean, I'm sure there are other areas too that are not really being picked up. But one of the challenges with interpreting those kinds of results is, okay, now we understand this particular brain area, which is quite big, relatively speaking. It has hundreds of millions of neurons potentially. That we know is affected somehow, but we don't understand how it's affected. And that's why these non-invasive methods like EEG or fMRI, functional MRI, they're very good in telling us from a holistic perspective what parts of the brain may be compromised, or affected, but they don't tell us about the mechanisms. And that's why we go to animal models, where we can actually use invasive methods to record from the electrical activity at the very high spatial resolution to understand what is about these areas that are affected. Within a particular brain area, there are neurons that result in excitation of other neurons in the circuit. There are neurons that result in inhibition, and affecting these neurons, if one is affected, it could lead to very different outcomes than if another type is affected. And so that's why we do these recordings. We identify the different types of cells in the brain that are affected, that are involved in different parts of cognition. Let me give you an example. So in a recent study that we did, we recorded from different layers of cortex. And so cortex, which is this outer part of the brain that we attribute with cognition, the frontal lobe, is comprised of different layers, just like a building where we have different floors, and each floor is dedicated to certain tasks or certain people live in it, and there are boundaries between them. It's the same with the brain. With the cortex, it's laminar in structure. And so what we have recently identified is different layers have different types of neurons in them, and they interact with each other in different ways, leading to computations that we call error detection or error adjustment. It's not every neuron in the brain that detects error that's also involved in adjustments in behavior. Only certain ones are, depending on what part of the brain they project to, what part of the brain they influence, because they also send connections, right? Now, also that biomarker, the ERN that we talked about, is not every error cell in that circuitry that's contributing to it. Only certain ones are. And it's a mystery how that is, but now we're working with biophysicists to develop models of the brain the way that our empirical data suggests. And so we can now generate currents and see how these currents that arise from neuron communication give rise to the EEG, because ultimately it's the electrical activity inside the brain that leads to the EEG, right? So we want to understand what is the origin of this biomarker.
And one of the things this is going to help us do and applied in clinical psychology is that's at the granular level, very granular level, but at the bigger level, we're trying to influence these systems, the basic activating system and the basic inhibitory system. Because what happens in OCD, they're kind of miswired. People inhibit where it should be, activated, and activate where it should be inhibited. In other words, there's a miscommunication, and then behavior, and if your behavior matches that miscommunication, obviously that's what results in progression of symptoms. And what does your brain know? Your brain doesn't have it's interesting when you think of your brain, because you can think, wow, it's this amazing supercomputer-like thing, but it doesn't really have any information. It just knows the information it gets from behavior and senses. And if that's faulty, if someone's avoiding something that they shouldn't avoid, or misinterpreting a sensory information for something that's trivial or not important as a thought or an emotion, like that, kind of like as a proxy in the proxy theory of things like that. If it's misinterpreting it, then your brain gets bad information. But what does it know? It goes along with it because that's the world it knows, and it's trying to keep you alive. Except it's actually acting like an overprotective parent in some ways, right? It's trying to keep you alive in a way that ultimately does you harm. So that's why I think that this confluence between this basic research informing what we can do in applied psychology is so essential to really start having these connections. Because how often do we as clinicians really talk to neuroscientists and vice versa, as Amir was saying? The dialogue isn't there in the way maybe it should be. And I just thought even in the weekend we had, it was so informative and so like a cross-pollination of these two worlds, which shouldn't be separate worlds, because obviously they're integrally related.
Yeah.
Good point. I think, yeah, you're probably the first neuroscientist I've probably ever spoken to. So,
I'm so happy to hear that.
So there you go. I'm a practicing therapist, I should say, for context. And obviously I've studied it a little bit, neuroscience, but not in any great detail. So, and obviously my lecturers were never neuroscientists, although maybe they studied it in more depth. But yeah, I think John's right in that, you know, when you come to meet us, we'll be talking about, okay, we're noticing this in our clients, or when we do this therapy, this is how their symptoms went down, or and then you can start thinking, okay, well, I wonder what part of the brain changed, or what, you know. Can you, bit of a far out question, but you know, if John or I say this thing happened with our client and it got better, and maybe it was different from what you've heard, would that signpost potential areas of the brain, or I don't know?
Yeah, no, exactly. So one of the things that I appreciate about my work is what I love about my work is the fact that I actually use experimental paradigms that are also used in the clinical world. So an example of it, I can give you a few examples. Now, the task that I have mostly worked with recently is the stop signal task, which is basically kind of like a go, no go task. Basically, you tell the subject, hey, do something. And then as they're starting to do it, you sometimes infrequently tell them stop. And this is where they have to suppress the urge to do the task that they were initially told to do. Kind of like the Stroop task. Are you familiar with the Stroop task?
No, I don't think so.
The Stroop task is that the color task where there's a text associated with a color, say it's written green, but the color of it is different. For instance, it's red. And you tell the subject that they have to say what the color is and not what the text is, right? So they have to suppress the urge to read the text and report the color. And so these are the kinds of experimental tasks that we use that are cognitive control tasks to study error monitoring, conflict monitoring. Here we have conflict between two separate commands. One is the text, one is the color. There's a conflict that's generated, right? So we do these.
Stroop test, I might say, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, it really is analogous to response prevention and exposure and response prevention, because again, in that basic inhibitory model, if we want to, we call it in our clinical way, exposure and response prevention. But what are we really trying to do? We're trying to suppress avoidance behavior or ritual and read the right signal to proceed. In our other language. So that makes sense.
This is why, So this is why I mentioned these tasks, is because they have a lot of relevance to the clinical population. The impulse control, like changing your plan, like you are set to your mind, you have the impulse to do something, but now you got to change it based on your cognitive control, right? That's what cognitive control means. And so these are the tasks that we study, and we train our subjects, in this case, monkeys, to do these kinds of tasks too, and so we record from brain activity. Some of the features of these tasks that are altered in OCD compared to healthy controls is that they are, like for instance, there's this phenomenon of post-error slowing, is that when I make a mistake, I'm going to be more careful. I'm going to take my time. You will be slower the next time you do it. And in anxiety disorder and OCD, you actually have an exaggeration of this. You end up, and now these are some of the average effects. You find this at the average level, at population level. Individuals may vary depending, again, on because there is heterogeneity within the population, right? So when you actually look at their impulse control, OCD patients fall into their impulses much more than healthy controls. In these tasks, they end up making mistakes more commonly compared to the healthy controls in the cases where there's conflict. And so these kinds of tasks are simple, but they can actually relate to real life experiences as well. And one of my goals, one of my missions is to introduce these kinds of paradigms in the clinical world so that we can actually have a set of markers or indices of behavior that can guide us to make better diagnosis of disorders and
better understanding. Because from what I think is saying is that within compulsivity, there's an interesting kind of impulsivity. It looks like compulsive checking, but it's an impulsive, like you can't restrain yourself from checking something, even though you have insight and it doesn't need to be checked. So, but it helps us really understand that what we're actually trying to teach is someone to inhibit that in response prevention. And I think looking at it in that kind of way is extremely informative.
Yeah.
And beneficial to our patients.
Absolutely. And so this is basically the big picture mission, is to really apply this. And now one of the nice features about some clinics like NBI is that they have access to patients who have symptoms that are often severe compared to some that you see out in the outside. And so that severity of symptom, which is very unfortunate for the patient, but it allows us to investigate these problems to a level that we wouldn't be able to otherwise, and so
Well, I think you pointed to an interesting issue that within the lab, OCD is often studied in the patients that don't have the really serious and complex forms of OCD, because researchers don't have access to them. So that's why this collaboration, again, broadens our understanding on both sides, on the neuroscience side and also the clinical application of neuroscience side.
Yeah. Absolutely. I've spoken about the possibility of collaborating with NBI to my colleagues, and a lot of them have expressed interest and they had even no idea that the experimental tasks that they have been studying for decades, and they have published numerous papers on them, they even could be applied to OCD. There are visual motor tasks related to the way you process space even. And there's some tasks that I never thought they could relate to OCD. And after interacting with John and Katya at NBI, I've learned how much overlap there can be, and what an opportunity neuroscientists are missing.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. And that's where the conversation comes in. So am I right in saying theoretically that if we took 100 OCD patients pre-ERP and they did is it the Stroop test? Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
And then they went through ERP, it was successful. And at the end of, they did the Stroop test again, we should see that they're better at that test. Is that what we predict?
That would be one of my predictions. One of my hopes, I would say, would be to see something like this. Now,
and the question would be, if we varied ERP, would we get better or worse results? Because one of the problems in conducting ERP, and we talk about this a lot, especially in our training program, is oftentimes we're not targeting the correct OCD symptom. I think by seeing how you could do on these tasks, back to us, are we going in the right direction or not with our ERP? Or are we just kind of thinking that we're benefiting someone when we're not really getting to the core aspect of their OCD?
Yeah. Exactly. Now, with one task, I would say there is always the danger that you're only zooming in on one very particular function that the Stroop task is testing. But so one of my objectives would be, or one of my recommendations in general would be to use a battery of tasks that tap into these functions, because each of these, like the stop signal task, the Stroop task, the go no go task, all of these are conceptually similar, but and yet different in some ways. And so I would do a collection of these experiments to find out whether I see improvements or not. Because in one particular task you may not really see a deficit to begin with. And so one of the issues, basically a general issue, is that you don't know what the baseline of the subject was before they had the disorder. If you had that, then you could say, okay, after therapy, we can actually expect improvement. But maybe their Stroop function was never compromised by the disorder in the first place, and you may not therefore see an improvement after you do even the correct therapy.
And it might be interesting to go really back in time with people who had a high risk that have a genetic proclivity, toward OCD based upon parents, and give some of these baseline data and follow this longitudinally. Would be,
Exactly.
That's a big task, but that would be something very important to understand, because then you'd have the information across the lifespan.
Yeah, and also with the less severe OCD cases, we could actually do measures to have some kind of it's not exactly a baseline, but it's a semi-baseline. And you can use that and see how, through the progression of the disease, performance in these tasks are changing.
Yeah, interesting. So the question I want to ask now for you guys is, and John, you raised this question, which is, why are there so many people nowadays that they don't seem to trust science? And maybe we can either answer that broadly or stick to neuroscience. And also they don't trust research.
Well, I think it's kind of ironic and an odd paradox to where science, as we can see, listening to Amir, what the frontiers of it are, and the amazing promise this holds for clinical syndromes and specifically OCD. At the very same time, there was a recent Pew research that this is speaking for Americans, I'm not sure elsewhere, but Americans are continually more and more losing faith in scientists and faith in science. And it's an interesting paradox. As one thing objectively is improving, people are less trustworthy of it. And, I think another thing to say here is that my understanding is that there have been studies showing that even if you do train clinicians in evidence-based methodologies, a few years after their training, they're not that likely to adhere to them. They're likely to become less scientific as time goes on and kind of come up with their own methodologies about how to deal with things, as opposed to, but imagine that happening in another branch of medicine. Like, all right, this is what I learned in my surgical training. Yeah, yes, there might be some innovation, but you know what? I think I'm going to do it this way. It's a very interesting phenomenon within the mental health field, because it doesn't correspond. We don't think of it in the same way we might think of, and maybe we should, of very specific medical fields, and the standards are different, and the ethical considerations are different. So that would be my first take on this. But I'll ask a scientist, like, what do you think is going on, Amir? But actually, Amir and I have talked about this a little bit.
Yeah,
about what's happening in the field.
Yeah, so I have. Yeah, so following the conversation with John, I actually thought about this, and I believe that one of the main problems is the media, the way media interprets scientific results. So, from personal experience and what I've seen in my field, sometimes I see papers that are published and they're impactful papers, but they don't really answer. They don't solve a problem. The answers are great for future research to be done, but they don't solve the problem. And yet, the way media communicates it with lay audience is as if that research really solved the problem. And so, me as a non-scientist would wonder, why is there still research going on in this field if this research solved the problem, right? And a decade later, you may still find an article with the same title. Oh, new research now solved this problem. And you were like, wasn't it solved a decade ago? And so I think the way media frames research findings is a bit, they do an oversell. It's just misleading to the public. And that's part of the reason why over time they lose trust in science. That's one of the, and also the way the journal system works right now, I think, at least in neuroscience. And part of it is, I think it's for good reason, because neuroscience for decades wasn't advancing the way that people were hoping. Right? We have been doing all these experiments and we find out about the brain, and yet our understanding of disorders like OCD are still relatively limited. And so a lot of the research has now become technique focused. So if you have a fancy technique that allows you to study brain function at a level that could not be studied before, an example of it is optogenetics, where you can actually disturb or manipulate specific neurons in the brain that have certain types of receptors, which is very powerful. It basically can kind of replicate what a drug would do in the brain in some ways. And so there are certain techniques that are now become trendy, and a lot of the big journals are encouraging people to use those techniques. So, but then scientists are becoming very method-driven rather than question-driven. So they're like, what is a good question I can answer with this method? Because I absolutely want to use this method because the journals like it, as opposed to saying, I have this major question. What is the best method for me to study this question with? And so I think that's also part of the issue. Yeah.
And do you think it's often like on a fishing expedition too? Because sometimes informatics, the amazing things which supercomputers are doing, people are data mining, and then they're data mining and seeing what shows up rather than having it being theory driven. It's what turns up on these very advanced statistical analyses, which may or may not conform to any known kind of mechanism of science. So it becomes sort of atheoretical. Hey, this is what we found. We don't know why. We didn't have a theory, but we found this correlative thing. And then the correlation may be conflated with a causal mechanism, which also becomes very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I do want to mention that one problem I think is that we kind of conflate scientists and research with the scientific method. And I think that they're not the same. They're not the same thing. That's one thing. I think we can have an allegiance to the scientific method of investigation and not confuse it with just sheer, computational power in research, and not confuse it with atheoretically driven research or not lack of mechanism information kind of research or correlative research. I think those things are very, very easy to confuse. And plus, as Amir and I were discussing, also the field has has some problems too. I mean, look at the replication problem in the field of psychology. There are these old, even very famous papers. It's very hard to replicate them. Also, there's been a lot of fraud, outright fraud in sciences. And plus, there's not a lot of science education sometimes as well. So people tend to distrust what they don't understand. Or push it to the side, and they'd rather go with their gut. And I think we're in a society that, interestingly, as science has advanced, paradoxically, people's trust in their own guts has advanced. Now, I personally wouldn't want to get medication approved by someone's gut at a research foundation. Like, well, I think this is pretty good. But we are in a funny time in our culturally with being pulled in these different directions.
Yeah, speaking to John's point about replication, one of the downsides of the current system, the publication system, is that journals often refuse to publish negative results. If you do an experiment which is very well orchestrated, and it turns out to not have a positive result, a significant result that you could share with the public and excite them, they're just not interested in that kind of result, and so one of the trends that are I'm happy to see that to be a growing trend is doing pre-registration publications, which is that before you actually execute the research, you have it accepted based on the merits of the questions, the approach that you're going to use, and you get it accepted, and then you conduct the research. And regardless of whether or not the outcome is positive, you are going to get the publication out, because a lot of the negative results or that are uninteresting are highly informative, and they can guide future researchers to not spend grant money on doing the same experiment. They need to know that somebody else did the experiment and it failed. Why should I now do the same experiment? So I think there are several things that are great about the system, but also several things that can be improved in general. And scientists are aware of it and are trying to improve them.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. They should be publishing when it doesn't go as planned. That goes back to that cliche of we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. But I guess with people in universities, they're probably so afraid of, if I publish this, I'll lose funding, I won't get tenure, I won't get that promotion. So it's ego.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny because the news tends to publish negative things as opposed to positive. So the biases in all our systems are quite contradictory when you think about it. So it's interesting to look from the very granular level to the macro level of society. And it's easy to understand why we're kind of in this tension point and being pulled apart in these different ways, because different aspects of our culture operate under completely different conditions.
Yeah, exactly that. Do either of you have anything else you want to say about this topic? Obviously, there's a lot more that could probably be covered, but any final words?
Well, I'll love to hear Amir's last words. Love to hear Amir's final say on it. But I will just say how it's really exciting and it's invigorating to have this kind of cross-pollination across fields. And I think we just need to kind of, even at our conferences and publications, working on projects, really have this intersection of clinical application and basic neuroscience research. I think it's really fruitful. And I think it's an area that's really largely untapped and I think holds so much promise, not just for us, clinicians and people in the scientific community, but really what this is all about is trying to help people. And I think it holds so much promise for our patients.
Yeah.
And I totally agree. And this is, as a basic science researcher, it's very exciting for me to now enter this world of collaboration with clinicians because I'm learning so much from it. And I know that there can be a lot of novel and exciting things to be done. And they may seem very basic, but surprisingly, they haven't been done. And I'm just excited about that opportunity.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you both for coming on today and talking about this. It's really interesting. I'll have to listen back to digest a lot of it, but I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. So thank you to NBI for supporting our work, and if you would like to find out more about their intensive outpatient services or the ranch, head to nbiwestern.com or the link will be in the episode description. And quick disclaimer guys, this podcast is not therapy, it is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional, and until we speak, take care.